Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhidamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om. We are continuing our discussion on this very important subject from the Vedantic standpoint, that is the eternal values of the Vedas. Last time we discussed some of the topics related to the evolution of the concept of God in the Vedas and the structure of the Vedic literature and the background and a few more details. Now, today we are going to discuss another aspect of Vedic culture. How these values, spiritual values, ethical and moral values from the Vedas were preserved and practiced by individuals, by families, in different social circumstances, how these values helped us to evolve and are still relevant, how and why they are still relevant today in helping us to evolve into responsible, ideal citizens and members of the family. So there is an interesting event in the life of Swami Vivekananda. When Swamiji returned to India after 4 years of preaching in the United States, he was coming back to the country, his own motherland, after a lapse of nearly 4 years, more than 4 years. Then he landed in Colombo, in what is now Sri Lanka, and there he made a speech. In that speech, he makes a statement, and the statement is something like this: if Manu returned to India today, he won't be bewildered, he won't find himself in a strange land. This idea Swamiji repeated more than once during his course of travels and discourses and lectures in India and Sri Lanka. Now, this statement in a way highlights the practical relevance of Vedic values in our own times. Swamiji was referring to this unique phenomenon. These ancient Vedic values are still being actively practiced. That is, in 1897, Swamiji made this statement in the year 1897 in his first lecture in Colombo. These values are still being practiced as they were practiced during the time of the ancient Vedic lawgiver Manu, who lived perhaps around 3000 BC, that is more than 5000 years ago. Now, what does it mean? What Swamiji was saying was, apart from the philosophy, the metaphysics, the theological and spiritual doctrines and ideas enshrined in the Vedic literature, there is another aspect to the Vedas. Even those who do not know the Vedic mantras, which are after all in Sanskrit language, those who have had no access to Vedic tradition directly, practiced some of these Vedic values, and they were preserved, practiced in their everyday life by individuals, by families, and in society. What were those values? They are called samskaras or sacraments. beliefs and rituals, conventions and ceremonies, all based on one simple important doctrine that Vedas are sacred. Those values have to be preserved even at the cost of great personal sacrifices. And this approach of sanctity and sacredness and the willingness to practice some of these values, some of these sacraments in the family life with a great sense of sacredness and sanctity at a terrible personal sacrifice frequently. This was the real explanation for the antiquity and continuity of Vedic tradition. Both antiquity and continuity. It is very ancient and it is still being preserved. I do not mean to say that every person in India is preserving or practicing these values, not at all. In fact, if you go to India today, you find many people who are not willing to accept or who have absolute disregard for some of these ancient Vedic values, unfortunately. But what I mean to say is, there is a large number of people belonging to all walks of life who may have no access to Sanskrit language or Vedic literature, who, without being aware of it, practice these great values. And one important aspect of these Vedic values, which I am going to describe now, is the fact that they depict human life as a pilgrimage in search of the fulfillment of the four fundamental core values of Vedic life called Purusharthas that I already explained, described in the last session. That is Dharma, Artha, Kama and Moksha. Dharma is the regulating ethical and moral principle that preserves and sustains and protects and helps us to carry on some of the basic human ethical values. Artha and Kama constitute essentially those aspects which are necessary and which are helpful in living a happy life in this world. Artha means the means, the tools, the instruments like wealth, physical health, prosperity. All these are necessary for a person to live, for householders especially to live in this world. Kama is the fulfillment of desires. So in order to fulfill the normal human ambitions like job, wealth, prosperity, worldly happiness, these are all natural, part of human life and human culture. And so in order to fulfill and actualize these ambitions and these legitimate desires of every human being, they need some resources, some instruments, some means. They constitute Artha, the means. And Kama means fulfillment. So that clearly underlies the fact that Vedic culture was not a life-negating, not a world-negating, utopian idea. It was very realistic, but it had a high ideal before it. So it is a unique blend of realism and idealism. So that's what we are going to discuss today. I already mentioned in the last session, Dividhohi Vedokto Dharma Pravritti Lakshano Nivritti Lakshanasya Jagadasthiti Karanam. This great statement coming from Adi Shankaracharya in his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. Vedic values are twofold. One is the higher values which are related to moksha, spiritual enlightenment. That's a fourth Purushartha. Moksha or liberation. Let us say the higher transcendental value, so to speak. So that is one. There are those who are mostly preoccupied with that. Just a few individuals you will find in every society who are contemplative by nature, who don't care for any earthly, worldly ambitions, but their number is very, very, very small. We call them the great spiritual teachers and saints and sages. But that's called Nivritti Lakshana. Pravritti Lakshana Dharma means the ordinary way of life for the majority of people. That's called Pravritti Lakshana. Nivritti means withdrawal from pravritti, withdrawal from worldly desires and worldly requirements and demands. It is called Nivritti, that is higher transcendental way of life. Pravritti means engaging in social, family, life situations, following these fourfold values. Now, there were many great teachers in ancient times who laid down rules and regulations and who taught these values to their disciples. Ankira, Yajnavalkya, Gargi, Bhrigu, Uddalaga, Pippalada, Sanat Kumara, Narada, and you find Maitreya, Shaunaga. All these are some of the great names that you come across in the Vedic literature or in those works related to Vedic literature, who emphasized this harmonious way of looking at life as a pilgrimage in search of a journey, in search of fulfilling these four core values. Now, the subject today is samskaras. It's called sacraments. These samskaras mean they relate to the certain ceremonies, certain formal occasions that every person has to go through. Again, I want to repeat that this was not always practiced by every member of the society, but this was considered to be the most idealistic way of living according to Vedic values. This was considered to be the most idealistic way of practicing Vedic values. So altogether, you hear about 40 samskaras. And sometimes in today's terms, you hear a lot about 16 samskaras. So 40 sacraments and 16, it's called Shodasha samskara. 16 sacraments. These sacraments are mostly related to the life of an ideal household. So some of these sacraments began even before a child is born. It's a conception ceremony, and then there are certain ceremonies, then ceremonies involving giving name, parting of hair, giving food for the first time, then initiation into Vedic studies, and during that time there were many Vedic rituals to be practiced and so on. So you find this very interesting combination here. So the first samskaras is called smarta karmas. So remember, smriti is a body of literature which explained how Vedic values have to be practiced in everyday life of an household, and how many of these sacraments are to be practiced. So some of these values are, in fact, are related to Vedic values. So I would say I shall try to give an outline of the fundamental 16 sacraments, because in a single speech it is almost impossible to give a complete picture. So there were certain sacraments which are taught to get 16 in number. Garbhadanam, it means parents were supposed to do a lot of spiritual practices like fasting, praying, prayer, fasting, chanting certain auspicious Vedic mantras with a sense of sanctity and prayerful attitude. At the time of conception, and then after there were certain samskaras which were again sacraments certain practiced, that also involved prayerful vows and rituals practiced by the would-be parents, so to speak. I mean, praying to God, praying to different Vedic deities for a cultured person to be born in their family. And there were certain samskaras which were performed before the child is born. These two, it is called, what I mentioned, say, Garbhadanam and Pumsavanam. And then there were about 14 samskaras which are practiced after the child is born. And the first one is Simantonayanam, it is called. It was a samskara performed for the health and longevity of the mother, the father, and the well-being of the child. In fact, this also was practiced before the birth of the child. And then from Jata Karma onwards, they used to practice certain rituals, sacraments, after the birth of the child. Jata Karma means a samskara performed at birth for the purification of the newborn child. It is called Jata Karma. Jate Sadi Kriyamanam Karma. I means a prayerful ceremony performed at the birth of the child. So you find 3 fundamental sacraments performed before the child is born, and then the rest after the child is born. So Garbhadanam and Pumsavanam and Simantonayanam were these 3 samskaras were performed before the child was born. So what it means is, the Vedic sages believed that if the parents prayed to different deities for the welfare of the future, the child that's yet to be born, and for his character, for his destiny to be a blessed one, then they used to perform these rituals. So that is how the pilgrimage begins. So the pilgrimage of a person begins before he or she is born. That is something very interesting. The whole life was considered to be a yajna. You find many Vedic lawgivers, like Yajnavalkya, Parashara, Manu and others, defining the life of a person, of an householder, as a pilgrimage, husband and wife together, as a journey, a spiritual journey in search of the fulfillment of their duties and responsibilities, so that they and their family, the children who are yet to be born, will be a blessing to humanity, and they will live according to the triple Vedic values of Dharma, Satyam and Rutam that we already explained in the last session. Dharma is the fundamental ethical principle. Satyam means truthfulness. Rutam means living in harmony with the entire cosmic phenomenon. I mean, the whole, looking upon the whole cosmos as one spiritual entity, living in harmony according to the principles of Satyam and Dharma. So, in order that the child who is going to be born be a blessing to humanity and to themselves, they used to practice these rituals. Many of the mantras involved were recited during these rituals, take the form of prayers and pleadings to different deities for the child to be an ideal person, an ideal member in the family, an ideal member of society. And then they used to start giving names. That was the first ritual that happens after a child is born. That's why Jade Sadi Kriyamanam Karma. It is a ritual, a sacrament performed after a child is born. And of course, after this, sometimes, in some cases, in some traditions, the parents or father especially will whisper Gayatri mantra and Nakshatra, the star of the child, to the baby's ear. This is not Upanayana, it was a ritual practice done in certain families. So if you listen to Gayatri mantra, that purifies the antakaranas, the mind and the thoughts and emotions and feelings of the child. That is the belief. And then sometimes the father will write a prayer recited to Goddess Saraswati, the goddess of learning, asking her to abide in the child's heart. So this was also an important part of the first samskara or sacrament performed after the child is born. The next one is, Namaskaranam. That is a sacrament performed on the 11th day after the birth of a child. Means the child's name is determined. It's called Namakaranam. It's called Namakaranam means an auspicious name was selected after analyzing the particular star under which the child is born, according to which they believed, the ancient Vedic sages believed that the position of the stars and galaxies in the sky have something to do with determining the destiny of the newborn child. So they make a lot of such calculations, and then they used to give an auspicious name. Frequently, every name had some auspicious meaning and significance. So that is something very interesting, very important to remember. Name is not something neutral. Every name has got a spiritual significance and meaning, and that is related to the time and the position of the stars under which this child was born. So you find in ancient times, during the Vedic age, they will consult an astrologer. Astrology was one of the Vedangas, one of the 6 limbs of the Vedas that we discussed in the last session. And they will decide a name. And the sixth sacrament was Nishkramanam. It is called 4th month after the child is born. That is, the child stepping into the outer world is a landmark in his or her development. It is called Nishkramanam, coming out. So after Namakaranam, which is the 5th one, the 6th one is Nishkramanam. So here you can find how an individual, a person is trained without being aware of it, to be an ideal son or daughter, husband or wife in the family, an ideal citizen, a good neighbor who will respect his parents and respect the teacher and respect the guest. So I mentioned in the last session the 4 instructions that Vedic teachers used to give to students who approached them for Vedic studies was Madhurdevo Bhava, Pitradevo Bhava, Acharya Devo Bhava, Aditi Devo Bhava. You should respect, you should honor, you should revere your parents, your teacher, and the guest who visits your home with the same respect with which you revere God Himself. So it is again a metaphor. It's a figurative statement, which means you should respect them, you should honor them. So that's how the Vedic culture was able to preserve its continuity and its antiquity. So there's a thread, an unbroken thread that blended them together, that tied them together into a garland. So similarly, when a child is born, these forms of training begin. So the sixth one is Nishkramanam. The seventh one is Annaprasanam. It is a samskara performed in the 6th month for the male child, and maybe in the 7th month for a female child. It's called Annaprasanam. Annam prashide yena karmana. That means is a sacrament, a formal ceremony or ritual in which cooked food is offered to the child, is ceremoniously eaten. So it is something very interesting. In Vedic tradition, they believed that what we eat has something to do in determining our character. It's something very interesting. So the food that we eat, it nourishes the body. The body is not the only not the only element of our personality. In fact, it's much more important to make sure that our mind functions properly, or at least as important as making sure that our body remains healthy. So this Annaprasanam was considered to be something very important. I mean, formally, ceremoniously feeding the child. They will offer food to different deities, and to the accompaniment of different mantras, sacred statements, they will feed the child. So now the point is, these values may appear to be a bit superstitious, maybe unscientific or irrelevant in modern times. But we should remember the attitude with which we eat our food and the way the food is cooked have a lot to do with forming our samskaras, our impressions, our character, our attitudes and emotions and feelings, the way we look at the world, the way we live, all have something to do with what we eat and how we eat and with what attitude we eat our food. So they believe that if you look upon eating food as something, as a sacred sacrament, then that sanctity will automatically influence our mind and our character. That's why this was considered to be a very important sacrament. That 11th month of the child's birth, after the child is born, sometimes, of course, there were differences in certain traditions. It was 11th month, in certain traditions 6th month, and so on. And then the 8th one is Chudakaranam, that is 3rd year. So in Vedic tradition, hair was considered to be a symbol of worldly desires. So the removal of hair indicates one's commitment to spiritual discipline. This was an ancient belief. Anyway, so that is part of the ancient Vedic culture. It's called Chudakaranam. So a samskara performed in the child's 3rd year. The Chuda kriyate yena karmana tat, the act by which a tuft is created. So many of you must have seen in the pictures of ancient Vedic sages is stuffed behind. It is considered to be part of Vedic tradition. All the other hair completely removed as an indication, as a symbol of removing worldly desires. Then there were other Karnaveda, it is called. The samskara generally performed between the first and third year after the birth of the child. The earlobes are gently pierced until the sun's rays can be seen through them. This ceremony is performed for the protection, the ornamentation of the child, and is done for both boys and girls. So, this again, maybe some of these may not have any relevance to our times, but certain values do have a relevance in modern times, even this 21st century. For example, the prayerful attitudes of parents when the child is yet to be born will influence the character, the attitudes and emotions of the boy or girl who is going to be born. And again, looking upon food as something more than a substance for sustaining or preserving or taking care of the physical health of the person. More than that, if you look upon it as something which has to do with determining our character. If you believe that the food that we eat influences our emotions and feelings, then eating food itself becomes a sacred act. It becomes a sanctified way of eating food. So that will sanctify our feelings and emotions also. Some of these values do have a great significance in our times. Vidyarambha is an educational sacrament. Now, this was done differently in different traditions and different sections of society. It's called, a samskara that marks the initiation of the child into the study of the alphabet and is performed in the child's 5th year. Vidyarambha it is called. So, Vidya arabhyade yena karmana tat means a ceremonial deed, a ceremonial sacrament act, a ritual which signifies the beginning of education, means learning the alphabets. And the next one is very, very important in the preservation of Vedic tradition. The 11th one is called Upanayanam. In fact, this is the most important sacrament related to education. A samskara initiating the child into Gayatri Mantra. It is not muttering in the ears, rather it is a formal instruction of Gayatri Mantra with its meaning. So by this ritual, a person, a young boy or girl, becomes eligible to begin the life of students and to reside in a Vedic hermitage for 12 years to study the Vedas. This is considered to be very, very important. So, Upanayana Samskara, it involved bestowing a sacred thread to the person, initiation to Gayatri Mantra, and the teacher takes responsibility of teaching Vedas to the child. Now, this is very, very important. This is considered to be the second birth of a person. This samskara or this sacrament was so important that in ancient times, the Vedic sages used to believe that if a person is not introduced to the Vedic studies through the initiation to Gayatri Mantra, he has only one birth. So this is second birth. Second birth means studying, being initiated into Gayatri Mantra, which makes you fit for studying the Vedas. It's called Dvija, second birth. Now, the most important and the most striking aspect of these ceremonies was that people used to make great personal sacrifices to perform many of the rituals which involved huge investment of money, effort and time, gathering priests and scholars from different places. But still, it was considered to be very important because the whole thing was looked upon with a sense of sanctity and sacredness. So that's why this Upanayanam was considered to be very important. Vedam Gurun Upasamipam Niyate Yena Karmana Tat is an important definition. That is, by which karma a person, a student is taken to the Vedas, towards the Vedas or towards the teacher, is called Upanayana. After this ceremony, they used to live as a brahmachari. Brahmachari here means student in the Vedic hermitage, and study the Vedas for 12 years. And after undergoing education, Vedic education for 12 years, they used to return home, and at that time they used to be given instructions. That's what I mentioned earlier. You should respect your parents, teacher and guests as much as you respect God Himself. Of course, after Upanayanam, there was another ceremony, it's called Vedarambha. It's a samskara that replaces the 4 Veda Vratas. The derivation is very important, Veda Dhenam Arabhide Yena Karmana Tat, an act by which the study of the Vedas is begun. So this is the formal beginning of the study of the Vedas. And then, of course, there were other ceremonies involving shaving, Keshanta and so on, which I am not going to details. But one important ceremony that comes in the 14th samskaras is very important. It's called Samavartanam. That is, for those majority of, if not almost all, except just a few of these students who studied Vedas for 12 years in the Gurukula Vedic Hermitage used to return home at the end of the 12th year to marry, to become householders. So that particular ceremony of completion of Vedic studies was called Samavartanam. That means it is samskara which marks the end of studentship. So it is an optional samskara and is performed only if the person chooses to take the next stage, that is householder. Majority of the people used to do. There were, of course, cases where great Vedic scholars took to either brahmacharya nishta, lifelong celibacy, lifelong studentship, or sannyasa, lifelong, or mendicancy. In such cases, the Samavartana was not formally performed. So it includes some fire sacrifices called homa. So they used to utter mantras, used to offer different things like clarified butter, twigs, milk, and different items on the burning fire. It's called homa ceremony, it's called. The 15th samskara is very crucial. It was the marriage. So this was a turning point in the life of an householder. One should remember that during the early Vedic age, both girls and boys both were initiated into Gayatri Mantra and underwent Vedic studies. But later on, during the period of Smritis and Puranas, which altogether about 25 centuries, 2500 years, this Vedic education became less and less popular among the women folk. So that is something happened which in later times. So Vivaha was the 15th. Visheshena Vahadi Idi Vivaha. This is their definition. It's a very important samskara by which a man endures the second stage of life, Grihasthasrama, from Brahmacharyasrama, after going to the Vedic hermitage of the teacher, that is first one. And the second, that is Brahmacharyasrama. The second one, the second stage, the evolution of a person, is called becoming an householder, where he has to perform his duties and responsibilities of an ideal householder, becoming an ideal member in the family, an ideal citizen of the country, and a member of the society, and so on. It used to be the tradition that after the marriage ceremony, one's primary commitment in life is dharma. Dharma, here I mentioned, the activities and thoughts and ceremonies and rituals performed by an householder should be according to the principle of dharma. And it was believed that if a person practiced dharma in his life, if he lives his life without deviating from the path of dharma, then one day he or she will realize there is something beyond empirical life, worldly life. And it doesn't make sense to lead a lifelong life within the same house, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and being part of the worldly life that goes on in the house. So it was a tradition that people who got too old used to retire to a Vedic hermitage or a secluded place to spend the rest of the lifetime in meditation, contemplation, or imparting Vedic studies. It is called Vanaprasthasrama. That is the next one. So this was considered to be very, very, very important, in fact, Vanaprasthasrama. So if you look at the evolution of Vedic culture, the Upanishads, and other related literature in the Vedic heritage, you find a good number of the great Vedic sages were retired householders. They used to live in Vedic hermitages, spending their time teaching, imparting Vedas to children, to their disciples, and also to those who came from different parts of India in search of Vedic learning. You can come across many such examples. Sandipani was living with his wife. They were aged, retired householders, great Vedic scholars. Many such examples you find in the Ramayana, you find in Mahabharata, you find throughout Vedic literature, including the Upanishads, you find these striking examples of retired householders who, after spending their time as responsible husbands and wife and parents and grandparents, then retired, both husband and the wife, to a secluded place, mostly to a Vedic hermitage, sometimes in a forest, sometimes in a temple, near a temple, and spent the rest of their lifetime in imparting Vedic studies to the new generation. That's why Manu has given a very interesting idea in the Manusmriti. It says, Grihasthasu yada pasye vali palidam atmanaha apatyasya apatyam tada aranyam samasayet. Something very interesting. When an householder, when he finds or when she finds that her face is getting wrinkled or hair is getting grey, or indications of old age, or when they see the face of the grandson or granddaughter apatyasya apatyam tadaranyam. When they see the face of their grandson or granddaughter, what happens? What should do? What should they do? They should retire to a secluded place and then spend the rest of the lifetime in meditation, in contemplation, in studies, and maybe in modern times in doing service to humanity, in doing things that will help the next generation and that will help us in preserving the Vedic tradition. So that was the great important thing. And some of them, after spending long years in the forest hermitage, in contemplation and meditation, imparting Vedic studies, will take to a life of mendicancy. It is called sannyasa. But it was a rare instance. And in normal cases, these householders, retired householders, after spending their time, then they will later on they will die, and then that ceremony was called Andyashti, when the body will be kept in the funeral pyre. So that's a very, very comprehensive way of looking at Vedic style of life. Now, apart from this, there were other subsidiary values and sacraments. For example, certain rituals and vows they have to practice during their course of study in the Vedic hermitage called Prajapatya, Veda Vradas. Then every householder was supposed to practice Pancha Mahayajnas. It shows their attitude towards the fellow human beings, towards living creatures in general, and so on. Bhuta Yajna, Nri Yajna, Deva Yajna, Rishi Yajna, Pitru Yajna. They have an obligation to their forefathers. For that they have to practice certain rituals every year. It's a Pitru Yajna. Rishi Yajna. These Vedic culture were preserved and taught and sustained by a long succession of Vedic teachers, who we call rishis, sages. We have an obligation. What's the obligation? We have to teach others. What we learn from our teacher, we should teach others. That is the obligation. Deva Yajna, sustaining the Vedic tradition and playing the role of an ideal host, being good to other fellow human beings, called Nri Yajna. Bhuta Yajna, being kind to animals, other living creatures. Then there were different Paga Yajnas, 7 Paga Yajnas, Ashtaga, Sthali, Paga, Sravani, Agrahayani, Chaitri, Parvana, Ashwayajna, etc. I am not going to those details. They were all special vows practiced during the Vedic times. Perhaps we may not consider them to be practical or relevant to our times, but the attitude, the ideal behind is always relevant and important. For example, Pancha Mahayajnas, being kind and compassionate towards other living creatures, Bhuta Yajna. Then the fundamental principles of hospitality and preserving our ancient tradition, heritage, Rishi Yajna. We have a heritage. Frequently, when we disown our heritage, our tradition, then we are voluntarily choosing cultural bankruptcy. So, every householder has a duty to play his or her role towards preservation and sustenance of the ancient heritage which they have inherited from their parents. So this was the idea behind Rishi Yajna and Deva Yajna. And then showing compassion, kindness to other living creatures. Then there were also Sapta Havir Yajna and Sapta Soma Yajna. 7 types of Vedic rituals, which of one type is called Sapta Havir Yajna, in which they used to offer different things on burning homa fire. Then Sapta Soma Yajna. So these are 14 types of Vedic rituals. Now they were not necessarily practiced by all. So the 16 sacraments are universal and they do have a great significance for our times. But just for completing this list, I should say Sapta Soma Yajna, Agnishtoma, Atyagnishtoma, Uktya, Shodashi, Vajapeya, Adhiratra, Aptoryama. Some of these Vedic rituals are still being held in India, but not by individuals, by collection of groups or organizations. They collect fund, and just to preserve some of these Vedic rituals, they perform this just to preserve the ancient Vedic ritual as a cultural legacy, that's all. But what is important is the idea of looking upon life as a pilgrimage, and certain activities that we do, like education, giving name, eating food, marriage, the institution of marriage, and the problem of retirement, what to do when you are retired from your job, from your profession. That's not the end of the journey of life. Every person can continue his spiritual life even after retirement. So whatever we do is not our professional duty, part of our professional obligation, becomes a yajna, done with a sense of sanctity and sacredness. And again, the sanctity and sacredness with which they looked upon the institution of marriage and the sacred duty of bringing up children so that they grow up as God-fearing sons and daughters. And when they get of mature age, they will look after the parents in turn. So the sanctity and sacredness of the institution of family relations, that was something very unique in the ancient Vedic culture. Many of these Vedic rituals that I mentioned may not be and cannot be practiced in modern times, but some of the fundamental values that I outlined just now, the sanctity and sacredness of the institution of family, the family relations. Family relationship was given a spiritual meaning and significance and relevance. And also the sanctity and sacredness of the institution of marriage, and the importance of retiring from active life and spending the remaining years in higher activities, contemplation, meditation, or reading scriptures, or teaching others what you have learned. Some of these ancient Vedic values are of great contemporary relevance, and they will remain relevant for all times because they are all universal values. One thing that strikes you when we study the Vedas is the universality and the antiquity, continuity, and also modernity, and how they are relevant to our own modern age. That's what strikes you as the most unique aspect of Vedic culture. Thank you. Namaskar. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Rama Krishna Arpanamastu.